You're listening to the Knowledge Archives podcast. Welcome to the Knowledge Archives podcast. We're a group of students on a mission to learn from as many different disciplines as possible. I'm your host, Eileen Farnood, and today I have the pleasure to be joined by Dr. Fiona Soper, an ecosystem ecologist and an assistant professor in the Department of Biology and School of Environment at McGill University. Her lab's research focuses on how nutrients mediate the interactions between plants and their environment, and especially how these interactions shape and will be shaped by global change. Though Dr. Soper's enthusiasm for ecology was born in the arid landscapes of Australia, her work now spans many ecosystems from savannas to the temperate biomes, and in particular, tropical forests. Dr. Soper, thank you so much for joining me today. I am super excited to get to talk to you about your research. I personally find it extremely interesting. So, just to jump into things, why don't we start off with a brief introduction of yourself, and you can also explain some of your major research interests.
Yeah, so my name is Fiona Soper. I am a Zimbabwean Australian ecologist, and I recently started as an assistant professor at McGill University in Montreal. I've always been really fascinated by how plants interact with their environment. So unlike animals, for example, plants don't have the benefit of moving to escape unfavorable conditions or to get more resources that they need. And so they've developed this set of really amazing adaptations to get what they need and to shape their surroundings to suit themselves. And so my lab focuses especially on how plants do that in terms of how they interact with and control nutrients that are essential for life and biology. And I work in deserts and savannas and temperate biomes sometimes. But recently, most of my work has been focused on tropical forests. And although tropical forests are only about 10% of the terrestrial surface, they cycle about a third of the world's carbon. And nutrients are really crucial to making that cycling happen. They're also a big control on how those forests will respond to climate change, for example. And so that's sort of our current focus.
Mm-hmm. And with regards to your current research, what are some of the very new projects that you've been working on, especially given right now, I guess in COVID, it might be difficult for you to go out there and conduct research on the ground. So I was wondering, what are some of the current projects that you're up to given our current situation?
So one of the really cool projects that we had just started literally a week before lockdown is based in Costa Rica. And generally speaking, ecosystems are really complicated and it's difficult to predict how they'll respond to a lot of aspects of climate change, like elevated CO2, for example. And the best way to figure that out is to do experiments, where you artificially, you might take a whole forest and you go in and you set up blowers and you artificially elevate CO2 and you study it for 10 years and see what happens. But those experiments are really expensive and none of them exist anywhere in the tropics. But there's this area in Costa Rica where you have tropical forests that grow on the flanks of volcanoes. And these volcanoes naturally seep out CO2. And so you have some areas where you've got these tropical forests and they're growing on areas where, the CO2 is higher, but they're not especially sort of hot or sulfury or any of the other things you associate with volcanoes. Mm-hmm. And so we have just started a project surveying some of those sites to see if we can study those forests that are essentially like a natural climate change experiment, to see how they will respond to elevated CO2. Are they able to grow more? Are they able to take up more carbon? Because that's one of the things that'll sort of control the trajectory of global climate change. That, admittedly, is on hold until we can get back to the field. And so instead, we've taken some of those same species that grow at those sites, and we're trying to grow them in the greenhouse and study their sort of capacity to adapt to CO2 under these really controlled conditions. And then, hopefully we can study the same species under very controlled conditions of the greenhouse. And then later, in the context of an ecosystem in the field. And one of the advantages of that is that it helps us understand how much can you learn from a really simple experiment that you can extrapolate to the field, Or do you really just have to do these big intact experiments? So that's the thing I'm the most excited about at the moment.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's great that you guys have been able to adapt to what's been going on.
Not much of a choice, really. Like,
yeah, that's
you can
true.
complain about it or you can just get on with it. So
You mentioned visiting Costa Rica for your research. So could you tell me a little bit more about this experience of what it's like to conduct research on the ground, which I think is really cool and probably fairly unique to what your area of study is?
I think there is sort of a public perception that a lot of science happens in a lab, and certainly some of ours does on occasion. But, ecosystems being these like incredibly complicated systems, you've got thousands of simultaneous interactions that are happening between plants and microorganisms and soil and the atmosphere that you just really do have to study in place to be able to capture. And if you're interested in tropical forests, like Costa Rica has been a really amazing place to work, sometimes also very challenging. Where we work is relatively protected. So Costa Rica generally has done a good job of conserving its natural resources, and it's extremely biodiverse, which can make it kind of challenging when you're trying to do things like, identify species. So one site that we work at, it's probably about the size of the city of Toronto, like not the GTA, just the city. And it contains 2,000 species of trees.
Oh, wow.
In comparison, like all of Ontario has maybe 70. And so it's an amazing place to study these like intact, productive forests, but also, comes with a fair share of like scientific and also practical challenges. We have to drive through 5 separate rivers to get to this site. And I literally mean through as opposed to over. And so if it's raining too hard and the river is up a little bit, it's just too bad. You can't get in or you can't get out. It comes with an assortment of sort of interesting tropical rashes and giardia. You have to be vigilant about snakes and scorpions, and don't go to the bathroom at night without a headlamp. And, other challenges, sometimes the power goes out, you lose frozen samples that you've collected over the course of months, or leaf cutter ants occasionally come and decimate your study plots and sort of eat every last leaf. And so, that kind of science really requires an open mind to like adapting and changing the plan as you go. I frequently feel privileged to work in these kind of places, despite some of the things that are out of your control.
Yeah, wow. How long were you in Costa Rica for?
I have been working there for, 3 or 4 years now, I think. And we typically go down for sort of 2 or 3 weeks at a time. And, whenever you're working in sort of ecosystems, they're very seasonal. And so you need to make sure that you're not just sampling things in the dry season, but in the dry season, at the beginning of the wet season, at the end of the wet season, and to really get a full idea of like the ecological cycles that happen in these places. One thing I just also wanted to mention though, when we're talking about like field research in the tropics, is that I think it would be a bit disingenuous not to mention that a lot of this research has been done by outsiders, like people who come from Europe, people who come from North America. And the research community has not always done a very good job of recognizing the expertise of local scientists, collaborating with local Latin American scientists. And that's, I think, one of the like less rosy aspects of this type of research. That's something that we really need to change and improve, and that we're taking some measures to improve. But I think there's a lot of local knowledge that's been overlooked by the sort of formalized scientific structure.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that you guys are working towards improving these sorts of relations and that this is something on the minds of researchers. And moving on to your research, I know you mentioned earlier that you were in Costa Rica for around 3 to 4 years, and that seems to be a really long time, at least in my opinion. So I was wondering sort of what were some of the insights that you've been able to gain from conducting research in this area for so long now?
That's a great question. So we've studied sort of a spectrum of things. One of the things we're interested in is the relationship between, so it's difficult to study systems like this on the ground. You have a handful of people, you're there for a few weeks, there's only so much you can sample. But the one source of massive information that we have for the tropics, for example, is from remote sensing. So we have data from satellites, data from planes, data from drones. where you can, collect information on a huge swath of forest in a really short period of time that you could never do on the ground. And we're interested in what you can learn about, the cycling of nutrients, for example, by looking at this remote sensing data. And so one of the projects that we have is we have these maps of the forest canopy done by remote sensing, where we can see the chemical composition of the leaves, like the amount of nitrogen in the leaves, for example, which is not something you can see with the naked eye, but something that you can see with remote sensing. And we used these maps and sort of looked and saw variation. So you have some areas where you have like trees with a lot of nutrients in their leaves, some areas where you have trees with less nutrients in your leaves. And by going in and then sampling those exact same spots on the ground, sort of found this relationship. When you have high nitrogen areas, you have higher rates of like greenhouse gas emissions from the soil, for example. They have higher rates of nutrient cycling. They have different microbial communities. And I think that was probably conceptually one of the most interesting things, is this idea that you can take this huge, very accessible data supply and be able to make inferences about things that are happening in the soil that are much more difficult to measure over large areas. And so I think that's one of the really promising sort of research avenues that's come out of our work in Costa Rica.
And based off of my understanding, much of your research has revolved around like studying the effects of climate change. And so what have been some of the insights that you've gained as a result of that type of research? Maybe you probably learned much about that in Costa Rica, especially since you were in tropical forest yourself. But just in general, like, what have you learned with regards to the problem of climate change?
I think that's a good question that sort of has some higher level conceptual answers. And it's really, I mentioned sometimes we do these simple experiments in pots and things like that, but it's really difficult to extrapolate from simple systems, so a plant in a pot, to the scale of an ecosystem, especially for something as complex as climate change, where you have all of these interacting factors. Not only will you have more CO2, but it might be warmer and it might be drier. And so in cases where we have done like big experiments, like I mentioned, setting up these CO2 blowers, the results that we find are not necessarily what you would intuitively expect from simple experiments. And that's really highlighted for me, again, that one of the most important things in science is to go into every experiment and look at every data point with a very open mind. So if you see the data and it does not support your preconceived notion of how you think this system should work, like, too bad, you were wrong, you update your thinking. And I think that if people understood that thought process better, it would go a long way to helping to counter sort of this common public idea sometimes that science is biased. It's like, believe me, we would love nothing more to find than like climate change is not a big deal. That would be amazing news. But that doesn't influence what I conclude when I look at the data. Like this sort of intellectual independence is really important. And in a sort of example from my own research, we did a project on invasive mangroves in Hawaii. And mangroves, they're not native there, they're introduced, they don't occur naturally. And so the sort of, I think, general human tendency would be to think that, oh, well, invasive species are bad. But actually in that ecosystem, these invasive mangroves, they store a large amount of carbon. They help with adaptation to sea level rise in Hawaii, for example. That's what the data says. And so that's kind of the conclusion that we came to. Yeah, not letting your sort of feelings about a system cloud judgment are a really important aspect of studying any complicated system. And climate change is a great example of that.
For sure. You've mentioned a couple of times already some general myths about both like the science community, but also like what it's like to conduct research on the ground in nature, etc. So do you have any other myths that you think that are generally misconceptions about either science, ecology, like what your research is about?
Yeah, I think there's a misconception about like what it takes to become a scientist. And I think that's really changing. There are a whole bunch of great organizations that are promoting women in science and like girls who code. And I think that stereotype is really shifting. But I think fundamentally, it doesn't come down to needing any, being great at math, for example. And I think the fundamental trait of a scientist is just being really curious about how things work. And that same trait is something you might see in somebody who becomes like an engineer or a mechanic or, any kind of profession where you're solving problems, figuring out how things work. And that if you sort of have that fundamental trait, everything else can be learned. You can learn math, you can learn the specifics, you can learn how to run an experiment. And that there are not sort of these huge intellectual barriers to becoming a scientist or getting involved in science. And I think also the rise of citizen science has been a great example of that. Like there are some great, particularly, in the natural sciences, in ecology, things like, people in their backyards studying leaf out times and insect populations and birds, and that have been a good example of the fact that science is not done, by very smart people cloistered away in an ivory tower. It's really just a thought process more than anything else.
Mm-hmm. And I think that transitions nicely to my next question, which is how did you become a professor in biology? And what made you decide that this was what you wanted to pursue in your career?
That same sort of trait that I mentioned, always wanting to know, looking at things and wanting to know how they work, that I'd always had from the time that I was pretty young. And I think that I could have pursued a lot of different types of science, but it just so happened that I kind of had my attention captured as an undergrad by a particularly enthusiastic professor. And she studied plants and nutrient cycling and aspects of that. And I sort of started to look into it and get involved and just discovered it was something that I also really enjoyed. And I ran with it. But that said, often, my projects, they do dip outside of that course. So occasionally meander into geosciences and study like carbon in desert rocks or big picture environmental issues like the future of the Amazon. And so I wouldn't say that my intellectual focus has to be very narrow or stays very narrow. It can vary a little bit. And then in terms of being a professor, universities are just where most of the research in my field happens, as opposed to something like, maybe pharmaceutical development, where a lot of it is done in private industry. And then on top of that, I really like mentoring graduate students and research students. I find that incredibly rewarding. The university is the setting where that kind of interaction happens. And then finally, universities offer a lot of flexibility to adjust your research directions and your questions so that over time you can sort of change gears to keep up with what you think is important in the field, what you think is interesting. And so there's a lot of intellectual freedom that I think makes being a professor a really rewarding job. Mm-hmm. And one thing I'll add also is that there are a lot of chances for people to give research a go, right from high school through to undergrad. There are paid job opportunities I think a lot of people don't know about. It's not only an option for people who have the freedom to volunteer. You don't have to wait until you have a degree to start doing science. I emailed a lab in high school and asked if I could just come and hang out with them, and they said yes, they were happy to have me, and it's one of the things that put me on this course. So there are a lot of opportunities out there for people to get involved and try it out and see if it's something they might be interested in.
Yeah, that's great. And now I know a lot of high school students are spending more and more time taking advantage of opportunities. And I think it's super amazing how more and more of these opportunities have been appearing. And it's so much easier for us to start learning about all these different subjects at a younger age. Even just searching online, I can find so much more information about fields which I otherwise would never have learned about. And so I think that's really, really great. Also, just moving on to a much broader, vaguer question. I know that you've already talked a little bit about the importance of ecology, your research, etc. But I was wondering, just in general, what do you think is the reason why ecology is so necessary for us to conduct research, and why is it so important? And also, what are some of the impacts that this field has on our society and environment as a whole? I know it's a kind of really broad question, but I think it can be helpful to help people understand sort of the importance of such a field.
Yeah, ecology is the field by definition is studying interactions between organisms and their environment. And that happens literally everywhere. Your body and, your gut microbiome is an ecological system. Your backyard is an ecological system. The farm where your food comes from is an ecological system. And so ecology is broadly important to sort of the study of just about everything, really. And then, thinking about some of the broader impacts of the field, some sort of like applied examples of how ecology is relevant in people's day-to-day lives. I mean, like urban ecology is an emerging field that addresses a lot of things like the influence of urban trees on heat waves in cities, on people's mental health, the impact of vegetation on the resilience of coastal communities to storms. There are a lot of examples from agriculture learning from ecological principles, like the idea that biodiverse systems are more resilient to disturbance, like droughts, is one of the sort of ecological concepts that's helping agriculture adapt to climate change. Understanding the ecological aspects behind like wildlife disease transmission, for example, are central to preventing the next COVID from happening. Ecology is perhaps more than any other science almost, is very relevant to every aspect of people's day-to-day lives.
Mm-hmm. And I think, like, even though it's so vague or like wide of a ranging topic, I think that's also what makes it super interesting for me, at least, because there's just so many different subcategories that fall under ecology, and like there's so many different areas that you could research in. So I think it's definitely a really cool field. So just to wrap things up, where could our listeners connect with you online if they have any questions, comments, concerns, etc.?
Yeah, absolutely. I am on Twitter at Fiona Soper, and you can also find out more about my lab group's research at our lab page at fionasoper.com.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to speak with me. I really appreciated everything that you mentioned in this conversation. I definitely learned a lot.
Great. Thanks, Eileen. It was great to talk to you.